Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Amber Serpent on the one and only OneTV.com. All right, I have so much enjoyed these last few weeks. The very first of this series, we talked about the process of spiritual alchemy. And then the week before last, we talked about the death and rebirth process, which is perfect because we are right now in Mercury retrograde, which has its own kind of death and rebirth phase around it. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And today, I'd like to talk about boundaries versus walls and the role of using our word as our wand. This is something that I've become more and more passionate about the longer that I have coached and taught and worked with people who are highly sensitive, empathic folks, spiritual seekers, and highly sensitive people of all types. The reason being is this seems to be a foundation of what mystical traditions from all parts of the world mean when they say know thyself. Any mystical spiritual tradition, if you were to really dig into it, Tibetan, Egyptian, voodoo, hoodoo, the Celtic tradition, ancient Kabbalah, or mystical Kabbalah. All of these different paths have this same philosophy underneath it, which is to know thyself. And just like the term boundaries is really open to a lot of different perspectives, so is knowing thyself. I can't really think of anything else that has actually more different sides to it than that, because each person's boundaries and each person's understanding of themselves is going to be different. So folks who are highly sensitive and folks who are spiritual seekers, folks who are empathic, meaning they can feel other people's emotions as though they're their own. So it's highly sensitive, on a big level. A lot of times we struggle a lot with this whole boundary thing. And that is connected to how difficult and or easy it is to speak our truth. And speaking your truth, first you have to know what your truth is. This is why there's that connection with knowing thyself. So this week I did write a blog on boundaries versus walls. If you're part of my email list, you've already been sent that. If you're not, you'll be able to catch that blog later on today when I post it on my website, theamberserpent.com. But how do we know what a healthy boundary is? And how do we know if we have a boundary versus a wall? How do we know if we don't have any at all? So these are, we hear a lot in, self-help kind of circles and books and things of this importance of having healthy boundaries. But there's really not a whole lot of definition as to what that looks like and how do we implement that in a practical term. I've even have seen some very even popular spiritual teachers say things on videos such as discouraging people to have boundaries, stating that having a boundary actually keeps the good energy out as well as the bad, the unhelpful stuff. This, honestly, in my perspective, is a teaching that is not only untrue, but can be dangerous, especially for those of us. The more sensitive you are, the more fine-tuned the boundaries need to be. Know that when I say fine-tuned, I didn't say the stronger or the more rigid the boundary has to be. So let's talk about what a boundary is. A boundary, I always think of it as like a filter. So if you have a cup of coffee or tea, then you typically will use some sort of filter so that you can keep the grounds or the herbs from being in the water, but still infuse that water with all of the nutrients and all the flavor that you are going for. And that's what a boundary does. A boundary isn't so much like a rigid fence, so to speak, between you and another individual, but it is like a permeable filter that you get to create and decide what energy, what information, what kind of communication gets to go through that filter, and what energy is going to stay on the other side. Because nobody wants a cup of tea or a cup of coffee that's got a bunch of in it. And just likewise, if we don't have healthy boundaries, we have a bunch of gritty energy that we can feel. You can feel when that's yucky, that yucky ick like comes into your field, and we can feel when we've taken it on. Our mood will change. Like, oh man, I'm all of a sudden I was in a good mood, but now I'm like pissed off, or I feel really sad, whatever it might be. And for those who are highly empathic, that can happen even without talking with somebody. That can just happen sometimes being in the same room with another individual or with a group of people who are in a particular state. So this is one of the reasons why boundaries are a really big deal, the more sensitive you are. Now, okay, so then that would be a boundary. Now a wall would be like trying to take the same cup of coffee or tea and filtering it with a piece of grandma's quilt. Then if you were to put that tea or coffee through there, not only would you not really end up with a lot of flavor in your cup, it is possible that grandma's quilt might be so absorbent that it would absorb all of the water and you end up with an empty cup. And that's what happens when we have walls. When we have walls, it can leave our heart feeling depleted, dry. It can leave us feeling very unfulfilled. There may not really be an understanding as to why we just seem like we can't really connect with anybody. And we can feel very lonely and isolated. So that is what a wall would feel like. Now, without any kind of boundary, any kind of wall, that would be like me just taking the herbs or the coffee grounds and just dumping a bunch of water in it, letting it steep, and then just drinking it down. And like, I've got everything. I've got the flavor, I've got the nutrients, I've got all of that, and I've also got a lot of grit and a lot of stuff I'm going to have to refine by chewing it, so in order to integrate it. And so basically not having a boundary makes us energetically have to work really hard. And I don't know about you, but I'm all about being more efficient, energetically, spiritually, mentally, business-wise, everything. I'm all about streamlining. And in my magical practices, I am totally not above, making things like really super simple and practical. I don't necessarily think things have to be really complicated in order for them to be effective. So then how do we know, like in a practical term, we have like some really good analogies here as to what the boundaries and walls and no walls are. What does that look like in a practical sense? Well, the one of the difficult things is that it's you that defines that. I can't, no teacher, no mentor, nor coach, no book can really tell you what your boundary should feel like, because it's yours. And what may feel okay for you may not be what feels okay to me or someone else. So the best way to explore what a boundary or a wall is, and if a boundary is healthy for you, is to reflect on how it's making you feel. And so here, it's not so much about statements, it's about questions. And I'm a big, big believer of the power of the question in all kinds of communication with ourselves as well as others. If we are thinking that we're making assumptions or we're not so clear, usually asking questions is a much better way of going than making statements. So, what are some questions that we can ask ourselves? And these are also highlighted in my blog too. I have 14 or 15 of them. But for example, one of the questions would be, this is one that really is actually something that a lot of empaths deal with. So if you're a person who is highly sensitive, it may be rather common for you to be approached by folks, strangers, pretty much anybody, and people automatically feel comfortable talking to you. And this is a gift. It really is a good thing. And then what will sometimes happen is then we end up with a experience where folks don't ask permission whether or not they can take up a long amount of our time with whatever it is that they're wanting to talk about. And suddenly we're in the middle of the grocery store with somebody we have no idea who they are over the rutabagas, and it's been a half an hour and they're like recalling their childhood with us. And a person who doesn't know how to maneuver that boundary might be like, I don't know what to do. I need to get home, but I don't want to be insensitive, and I don't want to hurt this person's feelings, and I feel like I'm helping them. Well, there are ways to communicate that boundary with and still honor that person. So if we feel in our interpersonal relationships or communications, whether or not it be with somebody that we know or somebody that we don't know, if there's that feeling, that heavy pull, I always feel it like as a pull, that pull to be obligated to show up a certain way, that is not aligned with what it is, how it is that we want to show up, then we know that there's a lack of a boundary. There's a weak boundary. So for example, the person who is probably a very nice person over the rutabagas, who's like recalling their whole childhood thing, we can state, for example, you know, I'm going to ask you just to pause there. Let me give you back what it is that you just gave me, because you gave me a lot. And then I let them know that I'm listening to them by summarizing what it is that they told me. Sounds like it is that you are dealing with a lot of processing over some old childhood stuff. And I just want to honor and hold space for the fact that, you know, that you have a lot of awareness around that. You know, for me, because it's part of my profession, I might actually, you know, give them my card at that point. But if that's not your profession, just honor it, leave it at that, and be like, thank you so much for sharing. I'm honored that you felt comfortable enough to share that with me. At this point in time, I do need to go, however. And exit stage right? So do we have a feeling of obligation? Do we have a feeling that we have to show up in a particular way? Those are weak boundaries. Do we feel isolated from people in general? That would be walls. Do I feel that like my heart is heavy, and do I slip into a place of resentment or being judgmental? That would also be walls. That could also sometimes show up actually as having weak boundaries. And what I mean by that is, let's say that I have a weak boundary and people, they don't ask for my permission for like taking up my time. People just assume a lot of things, that I'm available. I don't feel like I am honored, for example. If that's how I feel, then I might then run resentment and then get really rigid, and then, you know, like, no, I'm going to have these boundaries, and then they accidentally become walls. So people who have boundaries are more, Brene Brown says, are more compassionate. They're more compassionate because they are keeping themselves out of resentment. When they say no, they mean no. When they say yes, they mean yes. They're being authentic to themselves, and in doing so, they're showing up authentically in their relationships. And there's a whole course that I will be bringing up as far as like neutral communication, on how to maneuver through these kind of concepts in interpersonal relationships using what's known as neutral language, so that we're being respectful of everyone, including ourselves, and not over obligating ourselves in ways that don't feel like they're really in alignment with our health and well-being. And that brings me to your word is your wand and knowing thyself. So Is there a feeling of obligation to show up a certain way? Do people ask my permission for taking up long stretches of my time if they feel really comfortable talking with me? If they don't, then that might be a weak boundary. If I know folks don't feel comfortable talking with me in general, then that might indicate that I actually have walls, for example. So these are some questions to reflect on as far as if you have healthy boundaries, walls, or weak boundaries. And then the thing to follow up with that is, what do you want your interpersonal relationships to look like? Do you want them to feel like? And do they feel that way, or are there some missing pieces? Do you feel that you're understood? Do you feel that you clearly understand others? Do you feel that what it is that you speak, as far as what you're willing to do, what you're willing to offer, aligns with like what it is that you really want, what your heart really wants? For example, somebody asks for, assistance, and do you always feel like you have to say yes? So we call that the disease to please. When we feel that we always have to say yes and we have a hard time saying no, that would be an example of weak boundaries. So if our interpersonal relationships feel less supportive of our authentic self and how we would like to be understood, how we would like to understand others, and how free it is that we feel to be ourselves in our relationships, if that doesn't feel like there's an alignment, then there usually is an element of the boundary not being healthy, in that they're either too rigid in their walls, or they're too weak and they're letting too much through. I also would like to bring up, when we talk about that filter, we're not necessarily talking about only letting the feel good stuff through. So for example, when I set my energetic boundary, which I will walk us through here in a second, I always state allowing helpful energy through and only allowing helpful energy out from me to others. That doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be feel-good stuff, but then I can trust that what information comes through is actually in some level can support my best and highest good. I can trust in that because I've already set that intention. So I'd like to follow up with that on this concept of your word is your wand. We live in a world where it's common for folks to say talk is cheap. It's not really real unless it's written down. But the ancients did not feel that way. Where many of these mystical traditions came from, they had an oral tradition of conveying sacred knowledge. And this isn't just to keep it secret and keep it safe. This primarily, first and foremost, the reason why so many of those mystical traditions, so many of those spiritual paths that unfold the secrets of the universe, was because written language is only symbolic. There is no way for an individual to convey the vibration of a specific wisdom, especially when we're talking about, universal wisdom, through writing. When I convey it by speaking, I am then also conveying the vibration of that wisdom. It is not just symbolic, but the vibration of how I speak it also brings it to life and brings another dimension to it. So if I'm teaching another individual about some sort of ancient wisdom, it only makes sense that it would be an oral tradition where we pass it down so that the vibration can then also be passed down with it. We can see the same phenomenon happening in our modern world. How many folks have been misunderstood by a text message? I mean, go ahead. You can put up your little hand on the emojis or whatever, because this happens to all of us. We're like, because the way that we were thinking, the tone of the message did not actually match how the person received it. because it was not the vibration of what it is that we were there to convey. There was a disconnect, right? So the same thing exists for the ancients. In the Norse pantheon, they looked at it as like your word was your wand. And in fact, lying was tantamount to murdering somebody. Like it was a big deal to lie, because they believed that if you said an untruth, that not only did it degrade your own, what's called a weird, W-Y-R-D, and I know, like that's actually where we get the word weird from too, by the way. It's strange. But your weird was like your energetic progeny. It's like what you energetically, like I guess ancestral karma would be a way of looking at it. Whatever it is that I am passing on down to generations after me. So they believe that if you had a father or had family members that lied a lot, that didn't keep their vibration congruent and authentic, that you then would have some cleanup to do. And they're not completely all wrong. Like I work a lot with ancestral karma with my clients. So I see that this is really truly a real thing. So for those of us who live in this world where we've forgotten this, and we've forgotten that our word is our wand, that we've forgotten the power of the word to convey vibration, it can then be very easy to forget how we communicate boundaries. And boundaries also keeps your vibration authentic. When we have boundaries that are not healthy, then the vibration of our word is also going to be skewed, because it's not in alignment with what we truly mean. It's not in alignment with what it is authentically that our heart is wanting to express. In yoga, when we learn about the chakras, the throat chakra is called Vishuddha. And Vishuddha, one of its translations, is the great purifier. So it condenses information, as well as it is the pathway in which information is also released out to the cosmos as well. So this here, the great purifier, is also the place where we resonate with vibration by either receiving, listening, because your ears are also part of your throat chakra, as well as expressing. It's actually a two-way street. It receives as well as expresses. So if that vibration, what I'm expressing, is not congruent with what my heart and what my self-esteem is saying is true, and I speak things that are less than true because either I want folks to be accepting of me, or I'm afraid of rejection, or whatever. There's usually a fear part of that. If there's an incongruence, if it's not aligned with what it is that I feel and what it is that I want to say, then the throat chakra basically has a little bit more trying to come up with a word that's not a curse word. A little bit more caca to purify, right? It has a lot more untruth that it has to clarify. So let's be nice to our throat chakras. Let's be nice to ourselves. Let's be kind and loving to all of those around us by being first and foremost unconditionally loving to ourselves. And in doing so, we will be more authentic in our relationships with ourselves as well as with others. And being authentic with ourselves is the absolute most important thing in our lives. It's absolutely most important, because you will find that when we are most authentic with ourselves, that has a ripple effect. And those who do not appreciate your authenticity are going to naturally fall to the wayside. There will be more space between you and them, which will actually be healthy. And those who do appreciate your authenticity, those are going to be the folks who will be drawn in closer. And then we will have a full cup, because those are the folks that we will be interacting with a little bit more. Having boundaries is somewhat complicated, because it requires us to do a lot of internal work. In yoga, we call this svadhyaya, self-study. And yet it can also be, even though it's a little complicated, it can be one of the most beautiful litmus tests to our spiritual journey, because we can see if we're aligned with our authenticity by how our relationships feel. If my relationships are not aligned, do not feel in alignment with like who authentically or what authentically it is that I am wanting to express and share with other individuals, then I know that there might be some work that needs to be done on making those boundaries a little bit more healthy. Are my relationships feeling too rigid? Am I feeling too rigid? Is my body feeling rigid? Having walls, having rigid boundaries can also make the body feel very rigid too. Many times it'll show up in the tissues. Is my thought patterns, are they rigid? Am I going into resentment and judgment? Am I overanalyzing? All of those would be more too rigid of boundaries. Too weak of boundaries, am I feeling overly obligated to show up in a particular way? Am I saying yes when I really mean no? Am I putting what other people think and how they perceive me as being more important than what it is that I really want to say? And then there's also the piece of how do we communicate that? How do we communicate? How do we speak those particular truths in a way that's compassionate and respectful and still honoring honoring ourselves and others? So this boundary thing isn't just like a detail. It's actually the foundation of every spiritual seeker's path, because it gives us a feedback. It gives us feedback as to how authentic we are being to our own hearts and our own souls. And if what it is that we're sharing with others and what it is that we're expressing is in alignment with how the kind of life that I want to create. So it's definitely worth our time to go down to get down into the drawing board, so to speak, and to create a picture for ourselves, whether it be drawing or writing, whatever your method is, as to what kind of relationships we want. What do we want them to feel like? What does freedom feel like for us? What does safety feel like for us? What would my body feel like if I felt completely safe and freely expressed in these different relationships? Are there certain relationships where I have an easier time with this than others? Why? Are there certain fears in a particular context? For example, is it easier for me to be authentic in my relationships with my close friends than it is for me to be authentic with my relationships with my family members? And how might I have different boundaries perhaps for those different contexts? Your boundaries are not necessarily going to be the same things with every single type of relationship. So these are some things to reflect on, because if there's any aspect that feels rigid, that feels tight, that feels unfulfilling, if there's any part that feels that it's draining and we feel exhausted, then those are some cues that our soul is giving us feedback to take a look at some svadhyaya, some self-study, and to make some adjustments. And boundaries and using your word as your wand, using Vishuddha as a place of empowerment and self-expression as well as a place to understand. Those are all things that are continuously in the making. Boundaries aren't one of these things where you build them and you create the filter and then all of a sudden you're done, because you change. And so what you want to make in your life is going to change. The filter is going to have to change because you're going to be different. And that's absolutely okay. And I think it's healthy. So thank you all so much for joining me here on this episode of the Amber Serpent on the one and only the1tv.com. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you here in 2 weeks from now. Not next Thursday, but the Thursday after at 11 a.m., same time, same place. And if you're interested in weekly intuitive guidance on my own channel on the Amber Serpent, I also I give rune reading Wednesdays, where I give weekly intuitive guidance. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Namaste.